Montana Triptych. 1. God of my abandonment. When I was a boy, my father performed what I thought to be ugly work with his hands. From the body of our old bird dog, he removed ticks the size of garlic cloves, dropping them like dark coins into a bucket of gasoline. He put deer heads in a barrel of maggots until the skulls were licked clean. He set them on the roof of our single wide for the weather to whiten. Before they were beautiful, they were desolate. He shook my brother in the cage of his hands so the bones went and the face welled, and I looked on as a fool looks on disaster. We never knew love, my brother and I, until we grew old and found ourselves at our father's bedside, him holding our faces in his hands, kissing us and kissing us. 2. God of my fear. You knew the tree had survived lightning, been hewn in two and fallen the year before. I saw it bent from the base, the black trunk half quick, the tree both dead and alive. But what had hewn me, hacked some of the business from me, was the reality of that aspen on the ground at 9,000 feet in the valley above the Valley of the Wolves, still putting its arms high, flaring gold leaf medallions over me in a shout of love. My wife healed my unutterable hatred for my father. It was the color that made me sit among the branches, let the light brush my face. With the same radiance, she still touches my lips before we sleep, before we pray. 3. God of my illness. The illness was that I was always in pain, and the pain made me ravenous. Hungry, I had a terrible need working a wedge in me until I split people from me like bitter wood made to burn. Have you ever seen a mountain on fire at night? Noticing my ailment, especially how it accrued, my daughters worried me so, staring at me like creatures of a barbed creation. My hands were made for violence, I thought, but they knew otherwise. When I got out of the car to pick them up from school, they came to me, sidling their faces into my ribs, quietly putting their arms around me.
All right. That was Shann Ray reading Montana Triptych. Welcome to another edition of Poets in Montana. And thank you for joining us today, Shann.
You bet. Great to be here.
Yeah, I mean, you are in Spokane, Washington, and have been for some time. You teach at Gonzaga, right?
Yeah, like teach a few places. Gonzaga is my main teaching gig. I'm a professor of leadership studies and forgiveness studies there.
Mm-hmm.
And then I also teach poetry for Stanford and then sometimes poetry for Princeton Theological Seminary, the Center for Contemplative Leadership. So a few different venues, but all full of joy.
All right, all right. And the echoes of forgiveness or looking at life are in that triptych, that's for sure.
Yes, that's right, aren't they?
And so I mean I one of the things I as I told you earlier, as I mentioned, this little book came out in 2014, and I think that's I met you at that Montana Book Festival.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah.
And I heard some of these poems, and I thought, wow. And so you grew up in southeastern Montana?
Kind of all over, like my so I was born in Billings and at St. Vincent's right there. And then, we moved pretty soon. I think I spent ages 2 to 8 in Sitka, Alaska. So as a family moved up there, my dad was a teacher, and then he got a master's and then he was kind of on the move. So he was teaching in Sitka, Alaska and coaching. And then we moved back down to Montana. We would spend summers even then, though, on my mom's side with my grandma and grandpa in Cohagen, Montana. So this is, north of Miles City, about 60 miles, 30 miles south of Jordan, the beautiful metropolis of Cohagen with 8 people. And, Montana winters, I mean, it gets cold, so you got to have 2 bars even in Cohagen. You got to be able to bar hop even in a town of 8 people. But it served the local ranching community. and had a store and a kind of one-room schoolhouse with a gymnasium for dances and other things.
Right.
Little tiny gym, and my grandma was the postmaster for the local community, so her house was kind of a part of the center of the life and love in the community. She always had pies and cinnamon rolls. People could come get their mail, come have some coffee, have something to eat, play
Right.
some cribbage if they want to,
It,
head
it was
back out.
either that or the bars, right?
Yeah, you always had the options. That's right. And Grandpa was running cattle mostly, but he also did some. He had a truck, kind of a larger, sort of small semi. Back in those days, like they would haul. He could haul grain or haul livestock and things like that.
Right.
So that was the summers, and then we came back down from Sitka Foley to back to Montana, and then lived in Billings, then on the Cheyenne Reservation. My dad was first working on the Crow Reservation for a while, teaching and coaching basketball, and then teaching, well, principal, vice principal at, St. Libre on the Cheyenne Reservation, and teaching and coaching. Then Livingston for my high school years, same thing. My dad was there, principal and coaching. Then Bozeman for a couple of years of college, and some college basketball with my brother. Then Pepperdine, and then kind of out from there. My wife and I lived in Germany while I played some professional basketball in the Bundesliga there. And then, we moved back to LA, then up to Canada, and eventually down here in Spokane. So kind of all over, but a lot of time back in Montana all along the way too.
Yeah, and those kind of formative years and kind of getting a nice
Yeah, totally.
across the
Totally.
state. Yeah.
Yeah.
So in the basketball thing, are you and your brother, are you twins?
No, my brother's 2 years older than me, Crowell, and Crowell is a computer coder, lives in Washington over kind of in the Seattle area, West Seattle right now. And yeah.
Okay. But you did play basketball together at Bozeman.
Yeah, we had 2 years there before I then transferred to Pepperdine in Southern California after he graduated. And we played together in high school for, his junior and senior year were my freshman, sophomore year at Livingston there. And
Yeah.
then we played at Montana State too. Yeah.
So you're probably all wrapped up in the March Madness business.
Yeah, Crowell and I's team, the Bobcats, did great. Second March Madness in a row. So
Yeah,
that's
yeah.
first time in Montana State history. So that was wonderful. And Danny Sprinkle, the coach, is a good friend, and I was able to speak to the team a couple times this year. So yeah, it's been a good connection.
All right. Very cool. Well, I mean, how about a basketball poem? Is there such a thing that's handy? Is there
I
a
know. Let me think of. Well, actually, that's interesting. The triptych that you were talking about, they published Basalt magazine, that beautiful magazine we were talking about with David Axelrod, and so I'll read one there. So this is kind of like basketball is very unifying, and yet in America there's so much racial division, and I tend to call this current age, especially the sort of two political spheres that are meeting at the top in hatred and have lost the bottom, which is love and care and compassion for each other. But both the far left and the far right are practicing what I like to call the age of enragement. And that part of life, obviously being a researcher on both forgiveness and reconciliation, atonement, restorative practices, as well as love itself, the easiest way to live is with hatred for the other, or veiled hatred known as bitterness and name calling and all kinds of other stuff. So the nation's suffering a bit right now, and it is politically speaking, it's the fifth time in national history where we've reached complete impasse, where there's hardly any crossing of the aisles. But it will cycle back around too, because hatred is hard on people, and I think there is always the desire to return to a legitimate, authentic, even healthy intimacy. Basketball is somewhat similar. You can have all kinds of aggression in basketball, but the best basketball teams work based on love and care, service of each other. Many of the native tribes that I grew up with, the native nations, especially the Crow, the Blackfeet, and the Cheyenne, is where I learned to play basketball. It's no culture is perfect, obviously. However, that's more circular than individual-based culture, or more collectivist. So those three cultures specifically really are profound at passing and at serving the other. So that creates a lot of chemistry in basketball. So I was always working on that as a point guard in college and professionally, and just trying to build out the connectiveness. So this poem's about this the nature of race. It sort of takes it through, the South and our history of national, what you might call annihilation of non-dominant cultures through slavery and through the advance of Western culture into Native and Indigenous cultures. So this one, basketball often can perform a type of healing, and this one kind of gets more into the African American and cross-racial connections that any basketball player that moves forward is always going to be in wonderful brotherhoods across all different types of races and different socioeconomic statuses. And myself, we came from a lot of poverty originally, and then came into a little greater economic structure after college. But you're just learning to relate to people from all over different parts of America, whether it's Native nations or African American, different cultures. And players on my team and in college were from Dallas and San Francisco and New York City and a lot of different places. So that's quite a bit different than Cohagen, population 8, where I was with Grandma and Grandpa most summers. So yeah, this poem is called Godfire, and it is about basketball. Now in basketball, it's something to understand this poem. As a point guard, you're tasked to do various things, like, you're sort of like in a way, you're captaining this concept of team connection and cohesiveness and chemistry. And you're just trying to help build that out a lot. And, a lot of that happens through good defense, great passing, making sure your own shooting is at a high percentage, and then specifically making sure you don't turn the ball over very much, because point guards who turn the ball over are kind of like a disease for the team to turn the ball over. So you had to really, keep control of that in a good way. And then another kind of part of the highlights of basketball, and my brother and I were both big dunkers, and our teams at Montana State, which was this mix of Montana players and players from Texas and California and Michigan, were kind of known in that time period for all these high flying, slam dunk things. One of them as a point guard is to throw an alley-oop to somebody, which, people who love poetry often don't know much about basketball, but might know about alley-oops, which is you're sort of looking away from the person you're going to pass to. It's usually your wingman, which is kind of a 3. We call it a 3 in basketball, or a wing player who's a slasher or flyer. Usually they're in college, they're between 6'4" and 6'7". And some of them could really jump, and that happened to be my brother most of the time, but it also was often all these players I was playing with on other teams. So you sort of lead the other team to think you're going this direction as a point guard. Meanwhile, that your wing is sort of coming off on the other side, and then you're throwing, usually a no-look pass to your wing up into the air so that he catches it midair and dunks it, hopefully on top of everybody, and the crowd goes crazy. So this poem is kind of like a reconciliation poem that involves alley-oops. All right, it's called Godfire. The way your hands moved through midair, reaching for round light leather, has always been to me not unlike the intimate fusion that connects the core of high magnitude stars. Let's hear that again. The way your hands moved through midair, reaching for round light leather, has always been to me not unlike the intimate fusion that connects the core of high magnitude stars.
Yeah.
In the place where God shapes bones and ligament, fingers, thumb, and palm, we hated each other, brother. Until basketball made me a point guard, and you a swingman flyer who walked on wind. We had set our bodies to beat one another until our faces cracked like porcelain, and blood rivers ran the cheekbone shelves of a South sunk in wine water. Because America meant us for violence. But better than we know, God knew us. And now that the game is over, I can't unremember you enfolding me as I hold you to my heart and you cup your hand to the back of my head. Right. Yeah, like a story about how sometimes of different cultures we are set up to hate each other, but maybe we're meant to love each other.
Yeah, well, I mean, that's present in your not, this isn't, is this your first book of poems, Balefire?
Yeah, that's the first one. Yeah, yeah.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, those things are there in those poems also. That's sort of push
Yeah.
of love and violence.
Yes.
And
Yes.
yeah, it's I mean, it's the human condition, right? It's
Yes, it is in every culture.
yeah, yeah,
Yeah, it's well, you know, as a forgiveness and genocide researcher, it becomes very clear early that every culture has committed genocide and every culture has received genocide.
sure.
And so it sort of humbles us all into how might we, in general, make it right, you know, which of course for anybody, any type of failure I have in my family or with my children or with my wife or with my friends. Yes. I notice this light's in and out. I'll try to be in the right place here, but um, in any case, you know, any type of failure, we aren't often maybe taught this very directly, but you know, in our understanding of quality, healthy relations, you know, the healthiest people tend to ask forgiveness, make atonement, and change. You know, the unhealthiest people tend to be defensive and stonewall others' desire for us to take accountability and to do the right thing. You know?
Right.
And if you take that on a nation-to-nation scale, it's just very hard for dominant cultures to receive the beloved other who's asking dominant culture to make atonement. You know, that's a difficult thing in any culture throughout the world. You know? And it doesn't mean non-dominant culture doesn't have flaws. It just means that whoever the dominant culture is, it's very hard for that. Usually dominant culture is defensive and stonewalling. Usually non-dominant culture is what we call critical and full of contempt for dominant culture. You know, my life as a practicing psychologist, you know, has brought me through these passageways of, you know, this research of the last 50 years is truly profound. You know, it's basically what a lot of people would call the golden age of research on love or on authentic relating. You know? And on one level, it just makes sense. Like if I've wronged others, I should make atonement and make it right. I should repair with humility, love, and surrender. You know? But that doesn't mean that's what we actually do.
Well,
even if it sounds good.
it always depends on circumstances too.
Yes.
I mean,
Yes. There's all kinds of
there are all kinds of extenuating circumstances
so
surrounding a
much,
situation, right?
so much so. Yeah.
I read a piece by
That's
David White the other day.
yeah.
You know David White,
Yeah. Yeah.
the poet, and
Yes.
it was on hate, I guess, you
Oh
know.
yeah. Yeah.
And his take, of course, was that hate is like the ultimate sign of love. And
So
not
close, right? It's
hard
different.
hate. I
It's
said
on the
hate.
other scale. At least they're close, whereas indifference is like far away. You know.
Yeah, but I misquoted him. It wasn't hate.
Yeah.
It wasn't hate. It was anger.
Oh, interesting. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, it was.
I mean, those are somewhat close for sure. You know. Yeah.
But as soon as I read it, I mean, it seemed like I wanted to identify with it because every
Yeah.
time I've gotten extremely angry, it was because I was afraid something was going to happen to somebody. You know, like a
Yes. Yeah.
child or you know anything that you're trying to be the protector or the defender
Yeah.
or something,
Yeah.
you know, and make things go right. You know.
Yeah. 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 It's very complex. All the human relations.
Yeah, no kidding. We are complex. Give us another poem.
Sure. So I'll kind of go through, you know, the next few books that have come sort of after Balefire. The next one was called Sweetclover.
Mm-hmm.
And Sweetclover is a wonderful press called Lost Horse Press, and they just make beautiful books.
Yes.
And my editor was Christopher Howell, wonderful poet also of the Northwest. And if you're interested in Chris Howell's work, Light's Ladder is one of my favorite books by him. But beautiful, elegant editor. Christine Holbert is the publisher from Lost Horse Press that did Sweetclover. So that was, and they also did Balefire, which was very kind and nice. But so this one was a book basically about, you know, just love poems for my wife, but they're pretty much Montana inflected love poems. And so, you know, she didn't grow up in Montana. She grew up, you know, kind of all over California and Washington and Alabama for a while and different places, Alaska also some. But she's just a great person. You know, we've been together now. So you married 33 years this year, you know, been together 38 years. So we got 3 daughters, Natalia, Ariana, Isabella. They're all raised and wonderful women, just like their mom. You know? So anyway, I was like, yeah, it's books of love poems directly to one person that are about the long love, not kind of the quicker or the, you know, the flash love. So it was kind of fun thinking about this project, and you know, I call it a book about the marriage bed beyond nihilism, which I think is hilarious. And so, you know, you'd go to different poetry events like the Montana Book Festival, and you know, there's the national, you know, AWP conference, and you're always with different people that you meet or friends. You know, hey, what are you working on these days? You know, and I would be like, yeah, I'm working on this book. I think it'll be called Sweetclover. We'll see. You know, but it's, you know, it's basically about the marriage bed beyond nihilism, and you know, poets are pretty sharp, witty, heady types a lot of times. You know, and it would always bring about laughter. You know, and then there would be all these different responses. You know, and it'd be from everything from my hetero friends, my gay friends, you know, everybody, and you know, single friends, you know. But some of the responses were like, "Does that exist? Does a marriage bed beyond nihilism exist?" And then another one of my favorites was, "Do you mind if I write poems about that? That sounds great." Sure, you know, I don't have the corner on it. Go for it.
The whole genre.
Yeah, it was pretty funny. So, but when you're talking about love poems, I mean, how many love poems have been written? So, if you have a good editor like I did, Chris Howell, he's like, "Why do you want to write love poems? All the great ones have already been written. Make sure you consider that." And then, of course, I might talk a little trash back. Sounds like your marriage bed might not be beyond nihilism. So he'd be like, okay, you know. And but it was great to have that kind of editor, because you know, he just basically, if you're going to do something that's been done millions of times, what's going to be unique, you know? And I don't know that I was able to accomplish, you know, his vision, but I certainly enjoyed it a lot, you know, going through this book and creating an entire book. The way it works is basically, I was also studying a lot of atomic theory. We'll get into that too, you know, and kind of going back to the basics with Max Born's book called Atomic Theory, you know, one of the great original classics of astrophysics. And you know, just getting involved in these concepts of light, and you know, hydrogen being the you know, the sort of ultimate element in the universe, the most, you know, we might even say the most magnanimous, not just the most prolific element of the universe, but and then of course why we're all here. You know, without light, it would not be possible. So that of course says something about science, but it also says things about art, and it says things about beauty, and it says things about God. You know, across all dimensions of, you know, religion or even non-religion, atheism, you know, agnosticism and other things. But what is this? You know, who knows? But it's a good question. You know, the nature of light, I guess, in not only in physical properties, but now that we learn from quantum physics, well, maybe nothing's that physical that we thought it was.
Yeah.
Everything's almost not necessarily immaterial, but the material world is so tiny compared to the non-material world, you know, and as far as the universe. So light becomes this, I think, very unique element, but we'll get into that on the future books here. But this first one was kind of building the book. I loved this book of poems called Game of Boxes. And in that book, the poet, she built kind of like a central poem, and then everything sort of came off of that, kind of like in my vision, that's kind of sort of like how a spiral galaxy works, you know, like a central element like our galaxy, and then which is the sun, and then, you know, everything sort of rotates off of that axis, really, you know. And so much depends on, you know, everything about that, all the movement, the rhythm, and the, you know, the ways that light is influencing the planets, and especially, of course, Earth. But in any case, if you think about it from a book of poems perspective, so I built this. These are basically fragments. These are basically sonnet fragments. You know, you wouldn't read it and go, "That's a sonnet," but I thought of them as sonnet fragments, and then I thought of the central sequence, which is 21 sort of sonnet fragments basically, and that sequence is called Dark Horse, Bright Field. And it just sort of goes through these 21 sets. They look, they're very sort of, I don't know if we can quite capture it, but let me get it into the light here somewhere.
Yeah.
They're kind of smaller little pieces, if that
Right.
makes sense.
Short lines.
Yeah, and like poetry fragments, kind of back to Emily Dickinson. That one was the long one that I showed you, but in this set of 21, and then everything else sort of rotates out of that. It's a 3-section book, but so let's hear a couple of those in any case. Okay, this one's called Mountain Homecoming. We hadn't seen each other for days, but when I came through the door, her smile changed me from one who passes through this world to one who falls into his wife's arms and rests his head against her shoulder and feels when they lie down together her warm heart beating against his chest, her hands hungry for his holding, his hands alive to her happiness. So it's just this, homecoming.
Yeah.
Beautiful part of marriages, or any relationship really that has that belovedness to it. And okay.
Since makes the heart grow fonder.
Yeah, that's right. And this one is this is the closing poem of that book. I spent a lot of time with my brother, my father in the high country, and this one sort of gives credence to that in a love poem towards my wife, but it's called Wilderness. And it's kind of based on Sylvan Lake, which is, above the East Rosebud. And it's kind of in that big East Rosebud drainage that is the Beartooths all the way from Cook City, all the way down, and eventually Mystic Lake and then East Rosebud Lake. Sylvan's kind of up and off, not quite directly in that whole pathway from Cook City, but it's a very high, difficult hike basically to Sylvan. But you are certainly rewarded up there around 10,000 feet by cresting this rock bowl that you're sort of climbing up shale, and at the end, it's kind of sliding a bit. But you can grip like little roots and stuff to kind of get there. It's not like impossible, but it's a lot of switchbacks for feels like a number of miles before you get to that sort of ability to get over the bowl and then down in. It's crystalline lake up there. It was stocked, I think it was 1930s with golden trout. So it's one of the few places that you get golden trout in. And Montana Fish and Game still like brings fish from there to stock other lakes, because it's still, purest strain in Montana, I guess. Okay, so this is called Wilderness. Scaling the face of the Beartooths, beyond the last grip of roots and shale, wolverines lip the far ridge and disappear into no man's land. We go hand over fist, stand and look down on Sylvan Lake and her tail stream, blue echo of the day, bones of an eagle on the upslant at our feet, wing flare of longer and shorter bones. We select and set back one at a time in their form, carpometacarpus, radius, and ulna, hand bones and wing bones, spine, skull. At dawn, we find ourselves again in our tent on the skirt of Sylvan. Light in the bowl of the earth, light on your shoulders and hips, elbows, arms and wrists, the auburn of your eyes, jaw and body rise. Yeah.
All right.
Some love poems.
There you go. Yeah, that makes a leap. That in the poem, she's there, and
yeah, exactly.
she's there, whether she's there or not.
That's right. That's what you get to do with language, don't you?
Exactly.
Yeah,
that's a nice point. And how do you? I guess you can't say no one can write a love poem anymore, right? Because
right. Everybody's got to try. But and I love Chris's. He writes some love poems too, but his impulse is like, how do any of us as poets honor the long history of powerful, profound poems, and it's kind of getting at the discipline and the craft and the life lived towards beauty to we're all going to be unique just by being ourselves, but then there is the actual work involved in creating something new.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, what else? I mean, you moved, and your next move then basically is toward the atomic theory in terms of your
Yeah,
work
kind of,
poetry?
you heard it a little bit in the high magnitude stars part of that basketball poem, but those poems were very recent in Basalt. So that was kind of coming on the end of this move that went into atomic theory, and so, this is a kind of a mixed genre memoir called The Souls of Others. And that came about a few years after Sweetclover. And it has some of the kind of thinking that I was going through around atomic theory, and some of these concepts that come from metaphysics, or religious capacity. Religio, in its etymology, meant to rebind, kind of like to reconcile again, and had to do with ligaments, as you can hear it in there,
Right.
and this kind of binding the things that hold us together, basically. And so, in any case, I was looking at that with atomic theory, and was getting very interested in moving towards what became the next book of poems, which is called Atomic Theory 7. You can kind of see, yeah, there we go. That's a pretty good one. This I ended up doing a collaboration with Trinh Mai, wonderful Vietnamese American visual artist, and you kind of see what looks like
Right.
like basically a dove almost being vaporized by an atomic blast,
Right. Very skeletal.
Yeah, yeah. And so that she and I ended up having the poems, or I didn't know her, but her work appeared basically sort of bracketing poems I had in a certain magazine that had chosen these poems, some of these poems from Atomic Theory 7. And so I just eventually called her. I'd had the book ready basically for publication, but they're very heavy poems because I wanted to look at ultimate reconciliation. So kind of what is the question, in our lives of ultimate forgiveness in the context of ultimate violence? So that was kind of what was moving me on Atomic Theory 7. So I did a lot of research on astrophysics. I've lived a lot of in reading and research in my own background, graduate school and PhD in psychology on hermeneutics and phenomenology. And the study I did was on what is the essence of a hermeneutic phenomenological study on the essence of the forgiving touch. So I've always been also oriented towards and felt something like there's a deep call in the world towards love itself, and so I ascribe that to the divine, and as many people have throughout history. Many people do not. It's up to them and their choices. Great. So, but for me, it's always been like, oh, I've always loved that pursuit, and felt that there's something profoundly intimate about it. And so I was starting to connect that with atomic theory, and then of course this kind of what you said, anger and love being closer. A lot of people also say hatred and love being close, whereas indifference is far away from the capacities for hate and love. And I think there's a lot of truth to that. But okay, what does that mean for reconciliation? And we started to see all these powerful reconciliatory movements, which have happened from the beginning of time, but started to see them more overtly, like the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in South Africa in response to apartheid, or the Velvet Revolution in my own, home, genetic bloodline of Czechoslovakia in response to both Nazi infiltration and then eventually, extreme communistic, genocidal capacity inside Czechoslovakia. And then, places like the Nez Perce, who build out a powerful reconciliation ceremony where at the Big Hole Massacre in Montana, if you've ever been to the Big Hole, gorgeous commemoration site with basically skeletal teepee poles, no skins around the poles. So that's the commemoration, just this silent emptiness, and then each year the Nez Perce invite the basically the descendants of the people that were part of the military that did the massacring, to be with the descendants of those who were massacred, and to walk through the darkness into the dawn, carrying lanterns together, and then to sit together in a peace and reconciliation circle, and to offer and receive forgiveness. So these things are just so, I don't know what we call them. They're so refreshingly beautiful, but they don't come out of nowhere. They come from the heart of people.
Right. It comes from love.
Yeah, just amazing, right? That would be, and this happens also throughout the cultures, so it's just not as reported.
Right.
it's easier to watch a car wreck than to be a part of the healing.
Oh, yeah.
And so it's, but the healing is profound worldwide. So Czechoslovakia also, but you can find in every culture, the garden of peace and friendship, which sits above Medici, which Hitler destroyed in response to the Czech resistance finally being able to kill the master of genocide put in place in Czechoslovakia by Hitler, who was Reinhard Heydrich, who they called the Czechs called the Blonde Beast and the Butcher of Prague. They finally were able to kill him, and then Hitler decided to destroy an entire village that was nearby. Of course, they had nothing to do with the killing, but he killed all the men and boys that were 16 years and older, and shipped most of the women off to concentration camps, and forcibly aborted those that were pregnant. And then the children 82 of them were gassed to death. So this is the history of humanity, this deep hatred.
Right.
And so what is the question of ultimate forgiveness inside ultimate violence? Well, that's always been important to me in my own life. And interesting enough, it probably comes from my own genetics. My German grandfather, Herbert, married my Czechoslovakian grandmother, Catherine, in New York City during World War II when Germany was genociding Czechoslovakia.
Yeah.
That kind of sets you up to think, and they had a lovely marriage that we all believed in and appreciated, like these two. They really, square danced their whole lives out there on the plains of Montana, and she got grandma, who we called the Great One because it was just her presence and her basically healing force. She's a lovely, great force of wisdom and life. And anyway, she got 2 knee replacements in her 70s to keep square dancing, so, a lot of this stuff influences us. But in any case, getting to travel to all these genocide sites around the world and these commemorative sites, being with people listening, you recognize there is a reality to this force of forgiveness in response to ultimate violence, major reality and power to it. So anyway, that was this project. So I'll just read a little bit because I wrote about kind of the project as I was in this book, The Souls of Others, and that kind of what was starting to come into my life more around atomic theory at the time, and then projects come out of that. So that I'll read a couple from atomic theory before we close too. But okay. So this is just from one of the chapters in this book. I begin to comprehend how the body bears unaccounted trauma and becomes a nexus of multivalent fusion capable of complete healing, reconciliation, restoration, and atomically speaking, resurrection. Most people would not automatically think there's resurrection in atomic theory, but it is actually there. It's kind of fascinating to watch. So that's what I started learning. The body can absorb pain and emit light. The mystery of the heavens, physical, present in us, hydrogen being the most abundant element in the universe, commonly referred to as the essence of light itself. Hydrogen is essential to life. It fuels the sun. Hydrogen is the element with the symbol H and the atomic number 1. Hydrogen is what powers the stars and comprises essential elements of our own DNA. Its most common isotope or form has 1 proton with 1 electron orbiting around it. We've all kind of seen that from science class, right? A photon is a quantum of light, a discrete quantity of energy, created when a hydrogen atom absorbs energy, which means absorbs other photons, thus destroying those that are absorbed, and then emitting in turn more photons. So it's like how it leaps up, like they call it excitation, kind of the power. And this is, this part of the power of fusion and fission, and we'll talk about that a little bit here. But in numberless interactions throughout the universe, a hydrogen atom absorbs another photon or 2 or 3 or more with the right energy to jump up to another energy level. After each of these excitations of the hydrogen atom, the electron could recede back down 1 or more steps, emitting photons along the way. If a photon with sufficiently large energy gets absorbed, this can even unbind an electron from its nucleus. There's a process called ionization. These crippled hydrogen atoms are no longer able to absorb or emit light. I mean, all this symbology is kind of fascinating for humans. Do you know what I mean? Our own fracture and what happens to us, right? And literally, it's amazing symbolic. And of course, we're made up of hydrogen, too. Right. So these crippled hydrogen atoms are no longer able to absorb or emit light. That is until they manage to capture a free electron back into a bound energy level. When a hydrogen atom is crippled, it is only resurrected by this capturing process In the atomic realm, this happens innumerable times every millisecond. In this sense, not just artistically, but tangibly, the universe is both eternally dying and eternally resurrecting. And of course, we follow, astrophysics, people used to think that the universe was this enclosed thing. Now we understand that it's just expanding and expanding. It's kind of amazing. Okay, so as a poet, death awakens me and life humbles me. Admittedly, I have no real grasp of these kinds of mysteries. As Einstein said, there are two ways to live your life. One is as though nothing is a miracle. The other is as though everything is a miracle. This is Einstein talking. God is subtle but not malicious, he says. The most beautiful thing we can experience is the mysterious. It is the source of all true art and science. So, it kind of goes on more on DNA, but, the stuff that's common sense to all of us is fission is powerful. Fission bombs are powerful, but they're multiple times less powerful than fusion bombs.
Right.
And because one is based on fracture, the other one is based on cohesion or reunification. Similarly, in our lives, fracture is powerful, but it's not as powerful as reunification. So that doesn't mean we all get to experience reunification when we might wish for it. However, the quest for it is, I'm going to say, bound to the atomic foundations, the subatomic foundations of who we are and what the universe is like. So that kind of formed this book all about, okay, what do we do with the worst injuries we give to each other, and what do we do with our capacity for complete absolute evil? And nobody can ever again, after what we've all experienced of what we do to each other, just live a kumbaya life. We can try it, but it's not a real thing. Similarly, we can't only act like it's all pessimism, nihilism, cynicism, and anti-love. You know what I mean?
Right.
Because love gives evidence of itself, all the time. So, okay, so just thinking about all that, then I did a bunch of research on person-to-person violence, and everything from bricks, bottles, whips, knives, bullet holes, what we do to each other and each other's bodies, all the way up to atomic violence, and so it's just this big question of love in the midst of violence. So, and the subtitle of this book is, so it's called Atomic Theory 7, Poems to My Wife and God. It's sort of like written out to God. And originally writing them, I didn't think it would necessarily become a book. They were more like a good private project, and so they kind of were just building for many years. And my wife and I would, I love her insights, so here and there we'd read them and I'd hear from her, what do you think, and what would you be interested in around this question, ultimate forgiveness in the context of ultimate violence. So I'll read a couple of these as we come around here. And Trin, my wonderful friendship developed when I then did, email her, and then we started talking by phone, and hey, maybe we can do this book together, because like most poets, I would say, once our manuscripts are somewhat getting closer, we'll send them to our poet friends, and then hear from, you want to have at least one or two good poet friends that don't just say, oh, everything's lovely, they're not like your, I don't know, your best auntie who's only going to see the best in you. They're going to say things like my poet friends did, Chris Dombrowski, one of them, beautiful Montana poet. This is really beautiful, yes, but this is really dense, difficult stuff. You know what I mean? and we can all feel it, me and him and the others that I asked to read it. What are we going to do with that? And so we all, we're kind of playing with, it's got 7 sections. It's got this symbolism of, basically it's 7 sections of 11 poems. They're all sonnets. So that's 77 sonnets, and kind of this basic element that Jesus talked about of 70 times 7, and sort of playing on all these sevens, and who knows what that means. It's like a number of mystery, or the numinous. It's not like, well, it actually means this many times, that you need to forgive your neighbor. It's more like as many times as life calls us to. All right. Which also the inverse of that is like a lesser known inflection is, how many times should you ask forgiveness? That's not mentioned directly, but that's like what's under it too. How many times should a person make atonement? As many times as we
necessary.
Yeah, that's like some major stuff. That's one of the reasons why I love this whole idea of the world and who we are with each other. So here we go. And you'll hear the Montana inflection too, because I'm always putting, you know, Montana elements, wildflowers, and, you know, fauna and flora in everything too. But just somewhere in the middle, like the third big section, poems 10 and 11 and that. And then so what we did was put some images to break it up between these poems, you know. So Trin put 28 of her images in here, and just gorgeous. If I can be able to show you, but
Oh yeah.
so then her images, that was called Gathering the Light. And then I asked her to write about each of her images. So she writes a little, and then the 11 poems happen. And then there's a couple more images, and then 11 poems come in. Let's show another one of her images here too. And her family is perfect mix, because her family, you know, my family comes from this, like anybody's, but genocidal history, both committing and receiving in my bloodline directly when you think of the German Czech element. And then she comes from North Vietnam, but they kind of escaped to the South because of their religious beliefs, her family. And then with the fall of Saigon, you know, they had to walk, you know, through Cambodia, and many of her family members died, but, you know, they end up settling like many Vietnamese in the San Francisco area. And so, you know, we've got all these images of her work, you know, inside here.
Oh, nice. Yeah.
That's her husband, the color one.
That's got print in there too.
Yeah, and she'll be writing on it like this is for one of the children in her family that died. That's based on a picture. You know, what food did you eat? Did anyone save your life? You know, she's just questioning into the darkness. You know, right. Beautiful. So here's some of these poems. I've used a bone saw to remove the skull plate of a white-tailed buck. The crown a 5x6 in opposition and alignment, not unlike apathetic, brooding, rod-like bipolar fathers, or frenetic bipolar mothers, who clutch claw to keep from falling. Manner of injury known by distribution. In throttling, curved abrasions made by fingernails on the neck. They walk through my door, staring dead-eyed into the next world. Their splintered faces splitting with the nuclei, producing collisions, igniting the suicide engine with unknown binding energy. Traces detected environmentally worldwide. We blame them, yes, us, even as the doe descends the mountain in the evening to drink. Then to the next one. And it's all one long poem too. There's no punctuation. It all, you know, goes from the first line to the very last one. Here's the next one. Oh God, creating woman and man in the image of God, you created them. She sings from our small room in the pre-dawn dark. The major axes of light-bearing electrons revolve elliptic on the form of a rosette around the nucleus. Convincing me here, at least for a moment, she and I know each other. Our hands know our children are loved, and loved, they change us. And we receive them, owl clover, deer vetch, and currant. With gratitude, seeing you in them, she also imagines angels on the electromagnetic spectrum. She leans her body into mine in our bed, saying they go undetected. It's all just light. Too powerful to be seen, and you infinitely more so. With our daughters asleep in our arms, we remember we are wind-blown exiles, haunted by our past, and barefoot, we whisper to them, do you feel deeply loved? And yes, they open their eyes, the iris star-like wondrous. Yes. And then later in the book, so this is from the 7th section, sort of coming into the final section. 2 more poems here. Light is more contained, less fractured in healthy cells. Light are your kisses, O God. Light are the kisses of your mouth. Harmonize us, O marry us to each other, to the world and you. We drop firebombs, followed by atomic wounding, among the 1,000-fold wounding from which we never recover. In your memory, we are no longer at war here or overseas. The city, a melody like mountain blue jays over Sylvan Lake. Let him kiss me with the kisses, she says, of his mouth, for your love is wine. Mystic and East Rosebud in the Beartooth Range, where the Absaroka Wilderness sets the Yellowstone north to the Missouri, then south to the Gulf of Mexico. We want to be done with cutting and killing ourselves. We want to usher the beast into and out of our hearts. I believe we are all abandoned, all loved, Emmanuel means God with us, and we burn like stars. Crippled hydrogen atoms no longer absorb or emit light, but can be resurrected by choice. Deep tissue unevenly divided, foreign bodies in the wound. A curved laceration made of rock or water, the skin torn free or undermined. Blood is life. That's why we carry small stones in our pockets and set them in the vault of heaven. So yeah, it was a long, quiet project, that one, and finally came out. So, and it was kind of a struggle to get it out, in that, first of all, I wasn't sure I wanted it to come out, but then when I got with Trend Mai, then I was really interested in how it might come out. And then you have to kind of be very selective. Like, you don't want a publisher to not be able to capture her images in full color the way they're meant to be captured.
Right.
And so I was looking at, there's a couple of independent presses that do these combinations, not very many presses that are like both image and words, and then we kind of finally, at this one, said yes, we'd like to publish it, but then you have to go through the negotiation. Like, hey, I can't publish it anywhere. Thankful that you're open to publishing it, and really grateful for that, but can't do that unless it can be full color, great level print.
Right.
And thankfully, this is a publisher that does whip and stock, is what it's called, but they also do tons of textbooks. They have a nice poetry line, but so they have the best large scale printers with full color. And so they were like, it will not be hard at all. These things will look exactly like what she wants them to look like.
Perfect.
So you were overjoyed, and it turned out just like they said.
I have a question. Just out of curiosity, I don't know if you've selected poems particularly because this is the Poets in Montana, or if in fact predominantly a lot of that Montana sort of imagery is in your poetry.
Yes, certainly it's almost always embedded in almost every poem, but I'm trying to think, are there any poems that don't have some Montana image in them? I didn't select them just for this, for sure. It was just oh, those two should be decent,
Right.
So I think it runs mostly through. That's another thing we didn't talk about, but I was able to do this, honored to do this book with Craig Hergert, who's a great Montana photographer, panoramic photographer, Craig Hergert. And it's called Transparent in the Backlight, Montana Panoramic, but it's a 15-year retrospective so it's his second, major retrospective. So I think he culled it from some like 4,000 photos down to 395, all throughout in the entirety of Montana. Gorgeous book. 400 and something total pages. But in any case, he had asked me, because we had kind of been, artists that knew each other and admired each other's work. And I did, we did a little artist agreement so I could use his, and you saw it on the website. All of those photos of Montana are his, on the website.
Right.
But anyway, many years later, he's like, "Hey, I'd love it if you would write the foreword to this book." Sure, I'd love to. He's like, "Hey, I'd love it if we could use your poems throughout the book." So that, it's out now, and it's got poems about every 1 or 2 pages, and basically, just like what you mentioned, I just kind of went through all of my fiction, novels, short stories, and poems, and kind of just picked out sections, mostly poems, but some that were fiction, I set them to poems.
Right.
Kind of, lineated them a little and kind of moved them in a certain way. And then we sort of set, they don't all match exactly. It's got an oblique matching to it throughout this book. And then I also wrote maybe an extra 30 poems or so to go directly with some of the panoramas, and then he went back and took other pictures, for example, of the Nez Perce massacre site. And because, this poem evoked, he thought he needed different pictures for certain things. So yeah, that life of writing about Montana, came in handy when it got to that project.
So you were talking about a nice big coffee table.
Huge coffee table, hardback, massive thing, and yeah, it's a beautiful project. Yeah.
So that's coming out soon.
That one's out. It's out now, and yeah, it's been kind of going pretty good, And
probably going to cost me $200 for that baby.
You know what? I think it's between 80 and 110. It's up there. It's up there.
What you'd expect for a coffee table book.
Yeah, it's quite a book. It's one of those, always in our lives as poets, we're often like whatever we can do to get it into the hands of people. But that one's more like, okay, sometimes there's an extravagance that is worth the spending. You know, that one's not the cheaper one. Yeah.
Well, I hate to say it, Shann, but we have probably exhausted pretty much close to our
Yeah,
time.
it's been great, Mark. Thank you.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's been a pleasure to hear, where you're at and what you're up to, and we got some poems in there to boot, and yeah, and best of luck down the road and all
You
that you're
bet.
involved in. But there'll be more
Best,
poems.
and best of luck to you too, Mark. And thank you for you put so much heart and spirit into this work. That's a legacy work to have all of the people that you've put on here that I admire. These people that many of them have been people that have just given me so much life as a person. So
Sure.
thank you for
And
doing that.
like we said before, there's still another
Yes,
half again as many that
countless, right?
several,
Almost countless. Yeah,
yeah, several of which you've even mentioned that I've haunted and dinged and
yes.
poked, and we can't come up with
Yeah,
a lot of it's like herding cats, right?
totally. That's for
Trying
sure.
to get people together. So I appreciate that we could Zoom this
Yeah,
baby and get it done. And
totally. Yeah. You've got, and there's like the other thing I'm sure you've found, but this new flight of Native Nations poets from Montana that are young and alive. They're going to be the next wave, in my opinion. So yeah.
yeah, the just recently in the last week, young Native boy from Polson won
Yeah.
the Poetry Out Loud competition.
Oh,
He's
perfect. Yeah.
gone to Washington D.C.
Oh, yeah. That's incredible, huh?
Wichitawi Brown is his
Yeah.
name,
Wonderful.
and he's just incredible, man. He's just
So
really
good.
good. So
Let me
look,
put on top of that, fiction writer Sterling Holy White Mountain is just crushing it nationally right now from the
yeah,
Blackfeet Reservation.
right.
And but there's so many. Cinnamon Kills First from the Northern Cheyenne Reservation, just such a beautiful writer. And so yeah, this new generation is bringing us into the future.
All right, man. We'll try to get more of those folks before I'm out the door and maybe after. But thank you for
Yeah,
doing this, Shann Ray.
yeah. Thank you, Mark. Take care.
Take care.